We want to turn here to our first story and our first guest, and we want to talk about the Pope's visit to Canada and some of the context around his apology that he issued for the actions of the Catholic Church towards First Nations people for many, many years. So we are very honored to have with us here on the show Mija Kwan, who's an expert in Canadian law and policing in Thunder Bay, Ontario, and Layla Staats, who is a Mohawk from the Six Nations, a filmmaker, an activist, and a mother. Layla, Mija Kwan, thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Sego.
Well, you know, I guess in some ways, the first question I want both your thoughts on this. Mija Kwan, I'll maybe start with you. I mean, how do you react to what we saw from the Pope, the apology he offered for what the Catholic Church has done in relationship to the residential schools and Native populations in Canada?
Yeah, so I just want to just correct you on my location. I'm actually in Kenora, Ontario. That's in Treaty 3. Work-wise has brought me to Thunder Bay with policing. But Treaty 3 actually had the highest number of residential schools per capita.
Wow.
Okay, so when we're talking about survivors, we're talking about this area because people, frankly, are still living with the impacts, right? There's been no moving on. So we're circling 4 streets, frankly. It's incredibly painful what you see, that pain and how it resonates and comes out and harms, right? So talking about the Pope is, I just wanted to acknowledge a deeply painful experience, but it's also part of this healing journey, right? That all of us are collectively on, and we're just sitting at different stages, different locations, that's all. And I'm here to support everybody throughout that process.
Layla, I'm curious your thoughts.
Yeah, Sego, Skanagoaga, Layla Staats Young Yachts, Anawara Niwa Gitarodan, Ganyak Gehaga, Niwa Gotwan Jordan, Oswego, Nidawageno. So I am actually not far. I'm in Grassy Narrows right now, but I'm from Six Nations. I'm Mohawk Turtle Clan, and I introduced myself in my language of Ganyak Gehaga, the Mohawk language. But that language, it wasn't given to me. It wasn't handed to me as it was intended. It was something that I had to reclaim as a generational survivor of residential schools. My great-grandmother went to the Mohawk Institute Residential School in Brantford, which was one of the first and longest operating residential schools in Canada. And, you know, I agree, you know, that even the fact of coming out here to speak on this was kind of a challenge for me. When I listened to the apology, you know, it brought a lot of emotions, and it's very hard to process those emotions from understanding what is the way forward and what is the trauma that I'm still bearing. To the anger, the rage, the initial response that you have to it when you see it. And then pulling myself back to trying to look forward to those next generations, those 7 generations, and you know, what is going to be the way? Is it going to be this way of anger that I feel so deeply, or is there healing that needs to happen? And it became very aware to me, you know, it just in my reaction, my initial reaction, that I still have a lot of healing to do, and these images of, you know, headdresses and spirit names and things like that, they really triggered a deep-rooted response in me. And this is the effects. You know, I've traveled all over Turtle Island on this quest to bring awareness to the water issues that our First Nations communities are dealing with. And every place I go, whether it's the States, the Navajo, the Hopi, California, Northwest Territories, none of it, these residential schools, these boarding schools have left lasting scars that are trickling down. And it's not just something that happened a long time ago. It's something that my generation, my children are still healing from. My children are still feeling the effects of as we walk this, you know, red road to try and reclaim what had been taken from us. So I have lots of comments to make. I've been thinking about it for the last 2 days, and I'm actually very grateful that I got this opportunity, because it did force me to face it, rather than just, you know, giving that natural reaction of anger or, you know, it means nothing. I had to look a little bit deeper. and understand where it was coming from, why I felt that way, and my own perspective. So I'm grateful that I'm here.
We're grateful to have
So
you.
I actually want to raise a comment from one of our super chatters here, because I think it's obviously very relevant to this discussion. One of our regular viewers of this show, Martine Hernandez, also thank you for the support, Martine, says the Pope needed to bring a ton of gold scraped off the Vatican along with his apology. And of course, that leads me to ask both of you. I mean, as far as apologies go, this has been happening. It's become kind of like trendy, I guess, to make these apologies. And it's not wrong to apologize, but an apology is so little when you talk about the extent of the crimes that have been committed against Indigenous people across North America. Apologies are great, but we need more than apologies, right? I mean, you're talking about the lasting impacts and scars, as well as ongoing. I mean, settler colonialism isn't over. Indigenous communities still exist across North America, and are still being subject to all kinds of atrocities, denial of access to their land, being uprooted to create pipelines, all kinds of things taking place. So my question for you is, beyond an apology, like, what does this actually require? And I'm talking reparations here. Like, in an ideal world, what should we be hearing? What should we be getting from the Pope, from the leaders of Canada, from the leaders of the United States? And I guess, Layla, we can start with you.
Well, my initial response to the words that he said, when I examined them deeply, was that it felt like he was apologizing for their support, apologizing for the support of these policies, of these corrupt government systems at the time. And there was not a lot of present day acknowledgement or taking ownership, because as backwards and racist and debilitating as those policies were in our Indian Act and some of these government legislations, it was not in the legislation for children to be killed. It was not in the legislation for children to be raped and molested and abused in the way they were. That was the ownership of the church. These priests, these nuns, they were the ones in that action, not because they were told to by the government. So I think there needed to be a stronger acknowledgement of their actual role in leading this genocide. And you often hear, cultural genocide, and a lot of the legislation, yes, it was established to eliminate our culture, our connection to the land, to our language, to our ceremonies, to each other, to our families. But it was real genocide. It was real genocide. It wasn't rattles and drums that were found in those graves. It was people. And this is not just a cultural genocide. This is a real genocide that we have to acknowledge. So, it's interesting because as I'm in Grassy Narrows, I was just in Niskandaga, which has the longest boil water advisory in Canada. 27 years this community has gone without clean drinking water. And in my mind, I'm seeing this pilgrimage of the Pope going from city to city with these large press releases and these big events and this large travel budget. And I'm thinking, well, what does that mean? How does that help these communities that are scraping to be heard, to be acknowledged? I expect to see action. Build a water plant in every one of those communities that you're visiting. Let's see some actual action coming out of those collection plates that you've taken for so many years, put back into our communities. And I don't like to make it about money, because money doesn't help. Money's not going to take this away. Money's not going to reverse what happened and heal our people that are struggling with suicide and addiction and incarceration and these rippling effects of trauma. But it's more valuable than words on a podium. And I think that was one of the big things for me was, I see him going to these places, and a lot of people said, he should have just done it by video and sent us the money that he spent to get here, because it would have been just as valuable as the words. They're just words. So for me, that was That was something that really stood out to me, was the kind of the passing or the pointing of the finger at someone else. The church supported it. We're sorry for our support of these corrupt systems and policies, but not just actually owning it and saying, hey, we did this. We did damage to children. We did damage. We killed children. And this is where we're at now. And there's no more, kind of sugar coating it. We need to be real. And that's one of the parts of truth and reconciliation, is that we need real truth. And right now, you have all of these survivors that are constantly telling their truth. They're constantly reliving these traumatic experiences, and his action to create another investigation, for me, that just says more trauma for our people, more trauma for us to prove what happened to us. And we don't need to prove it anymore. It's fact. It's there. So these investigations, they just drum up our elders, our survivors, having to relive these experiences over and over again, and only to think that, there really won't be any justice. There really won't be anyone actually taking responsibility or being accountable. So it's a very hard situation a very hard pill to swallow.
Mm-hmm. And Mijay Kwan, if you want to also respond to the notion of like apology in words versus actual like actions to deal with what's taken place.
Sure. So I'm speaking just from again our area, our teachings, and Anishinaabe, right? And just how language and the words and labeling, that's ownership, right? My last name is Seymour. That came from somebody, right? And so, there's this thread that kind of, this trauma thread that unites all of us, frankly, because whether you were on the abused or the abuser side, or commission, and I think that people who participated actively in looking the other way, those are the most harmful actions, actually, that one can take, the inactions, right? And so our language is 70% verb-based. So it's actually built in our language, the accountability, right? And English is a tool, is a weapon, and spiritual abuse, right? So we're talking about really big concepts here. How do you go about in this manner of colonizing, of taking over somebody's religion and forcing this on children, right? And that autonomy that we all have as people, that was just stripped from us because we were designated as savages, because our children were seen as less than, right? And we're still fighting to be seen as worthy, frankly. And that's the exhaustive part. So when I'm talking to survivors who were headed there, and I'm not to diminish people's healing, because there are a lot of people who are of faith, is all else I'll put it. I don't know exactly if it's Catholic or Christian, but like, we've been touched and adopted. A lot of people have adopted those religions. So I think of them and how conflicted they are, but there has been some healing that's occurred because there's been conversations that have been forced again, though, right? And so we're talking about this forceful, this paternalistic approach, because when they came, they started with the church. The church is the thing that structured everything from that. So spiritual law, right? And that there's this cultural imperialism, that there's this hierarchy, when really we're talking laws of the land. And as we sit here in this pandemic globally and everything else, like, we cannot ignore spiritual laws. And I think this is the message that hopefully the Pope is receiving, because as much as we're talking about how we feel, like, I hope he is taking notes, and he came here to learn in earnest, because a lot of people actually have put a lot of themselves into it still. Either that was through force, through colonization, right? And they're still carrying that hurt and that pain and that trauma that has to heal. But either way, it exists, right? And so it's valid. Everything is valid throughout this journey that we're on. But sincerely, I do hope that the Pope understands, to the degree that he has to, in his role and capacity here as a spiritual leader and advisor globally, So that's my wish there. Big wish.
Well, one thing I also want both your thoughts on. Mijiko, I'll ask you first. I've noticed today the big news, at least in the U.S. media, is that the government of Canada is saying, "Oh, the Pope needs to do more. The Pope needs to do more," and which seems fine. But I thought, well, I'm assuming they probably need to do more too. So it almost felt like it's like sort of displacing a lot of blame. Like, yeah, that guy over there better do a lot, while to make it look like they're doing everything. But talk about the First Nation sovereignty and the Trudeau government and where they sit in all this, because it struck me as a very much sort of look over here while we do something over there kind of statement.
And I'm just going to say, because your audience, right, is a wide-reaching audience. So in Canada, we have been recognized where American Indians are still fighting to get boarding schools recognized by the government, right? And so for American Indians sitting here and having this news, like, they probably feel pretty sick, frankly, to still be fighting for that, right? Meanwhile, up north here, yes, we've recognized, but so what? Have we gone back and reverted that apparently this is the savior and Trudeau is helpless? Like, I don't believe that for a second. You have the most powerful people who they say they've committed to this, but I challenge that because the actions speak louder than the words, and this is the cautionary that I see a lot of the Indigenous community holding on to. And I don't blame them, because we've seen this before, right? And we've seen this government divide and conquer. And so the stronger that we stay united in a respectful manner, I see that's the strength, that's the power, that's the opportunity that exists out of, frankly, a lot of political bullshit.
Layla, your thoughts?
Yeah, I have to agree. And one of the first things that stood out to me was the division that this has created, because like you said, we do have many in our communities that are Catholic or Christian and have adopted that faith, and we have people that are looking for peace, and then we have people that are just so hurt and angry they can't even see it in front of them. They can't even see the idea of peace. So there's these divisions that have been created systematically throughout the history of our country to put us against each other. And I think that this is another example of where we could go down that road, or we could choose another road, as Indigenous people. And one of our stories as Haudenosaunee is the peacemaker and the white pine of peace. And we all come together and we bury our weapons under that white pine of peace, and we acknowledge and respect each other. And I feel like this is our chance, as angry and as enraged as we may feel, the fact that we have this voice and we are still here to use it, that says something. And when we can unify that voice in these hopes for, peace and truth and reconciliation and moving forward in a country that is healing, we have more power to do that. But it's hard in this, even in Canada, where yes, we do have more acknowledgement, and there is more recognition happening of Indigenous history and culture and identity. You go to every event and you hear a land acknowledgement of whose land this was, and you, after 2 years of hearing those land acknowledgements, many of us, find them almost offensive, because there has been no action on the backside from this government to support those land acknowledgements, to put their action where these words are going. Whose land is this? Well, give it back then. Like this is the idea of land back, and this movement of land back. It's not just like something we're putting out there. Our lands have been taken, and they have been destroyed in many instances. I was just out in New Mexico with the Navajo, and their water is literally poison. There is a silent genocide of their elders, of their people. Every single person I spoke to had cancer. And this is from 20 years of mining on their territory, of uranium mining, and just no consequence, no forward thought to the repercussions of our resource extraction. And this is why these Indigenous perspectives are so vital. We talk about climate change. Like, this is not just change. We are in a climate emergency, and we have to act now. And these ideas of Indigenous knowledge, I can remember, two things I was taught by my elders. And one was, you don't take more than you need, and you leave things better than you found them. And these two simple ideas, if we had operated in this Canadian government, in this idea of building this country with those in mind, we wouldn't be in this crisis. We wouldn't be seeing the fires, the floods, the global warming, the icebergs melting, the landscape changing, the fishes that, the animals that we depend on for survival being poisoned and poisoning our children. So I think Canada has a lot to learn. Canada has a lot to acknowledge still in this idea, and that you're right, like that idea of pointing fingers at each other and, well, they need to do more. Tell us what you're going to do. Tell us what your action is, rather than pointing out the Pope and saying, well, the church needs to apologize, and that's not enough. And well, I would say that Canada needs to do more, and our governments and these policies that I've seen putting our people in literally third world conditions. I just took a drive around Grassy Narrows Reserve and had a tour from one of the community members, and she said it's like we're living in a third world, and we are in one of the most prosperous countries in all of the world. We have the most fresh water supply of all countries, but yet our people have gone 27 years without access to clean water. They're being poisoned by industry that is tearing our lands apart. And there feels like there's no acknowledgement. I spoke to one of the youth in Niskandaga, where they are currently in a state of emergency because of their youth suicide. And she said to me, it feels like we don't exist. And for me, it really hit home. It was like, these kids feel like their voices don't matter in this country. These kids feel ignored by their country, by this so-called government that is supposed to take care of us, when many of us, we turn on the taps, we use the water, we don't even give it a thought. We don't even honor that water or know where it came from or where it's going or who's taking care of it or who's protecting it. It's just an out of thought, out of mind. And here, it's, these children feel forgotten about. I just feel like we're at a shift. I do feel it. And that's my message of hope, is because I want to focus on hope. I want to focus on, what would the peacemaker do? And it's like an acronym that I jolt myself sometimes when I feel that trauma coming and that anger and that, that sadness. It's like, what would the peacemaker do? He would open the doors. Everyone has a space. We all are healing together. I do a lot of work with non-Indigenous, and I know there's a shame. I know there's a guilt that is heavy and weighing on this history of this country. And we all need to be able to create that safe space where we can heal together. And so my message of hope is that, I feel that there is a shift. I feel for one of the first times in my life that people are paying attention and people are listening, and people are not just willing to accept the words of our government as face value. They're demanding more. We must demand more of our governments. We must force them into taking that acknowledgement, taking that ownership of their role in protecting, all people of this country. So yeah, I feel it's coming. It's like a buzz inside of me that, people are waking up. And I feel like once you know something, you can't unknow it. Now that you know the atrocities that happened, every Indigenous person you talk to, you know that about their history. You understand it. It's an acceptance. And we can't just erase that from our minds. So there is no way for us to go forward without, changing, without evolving, because we know now, because the truth is out. So now that path to reconciliation, the more that we fill that truth barrel, it becomes clearer.
Right on. Well, I always appreciate a message of hope. I think that's very important for us to carry across everything. And Layla Mijuquan, thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side. Really appreciate you giving us some of your time.
Nyawa.
Miigwech.